and welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that just fills the air. Maybe I ought to invest in some Glade plugins. Anyway, today we are going to delve into the world of radio broadcasting. Of course, this being the archive, not in any kind of, meaningful way, of course. Hell no. Today, we are going to take a look at what has to be simultaneously the most infamous and famous radio production library of all time. Today, we're going to indulge in some cheap radio thrills. There really isn't much of a history lesson to give here, but here's what I've got. At least as far back as the 1960s, many radio stations have relied on stock music and sound effects to fill out the sound of their commercials, station IDs, news and weather updates, and so on. Not to mention give the morning Zoo Crew shows something to play with. No later than 1976, Los Angeles-based broadcaster Terry Moss unveiled the first volume of the LA Air Force's cheap radio thrills. I think we can safely argue that the cheap radio thrills moniker is double-edged. On the one hand, much of the material sounds cheap, and much of it was done fiercely tongue-in-cheek. On the other hand, as the name implies, it was indeed meant to be an inexpensive solution for radio stations that needed the occasional music bed or sound effect with no need for further licensing. Your owning a copy of the disc was your license. To put this in perspective, as of October of 1976, cheap radio thrills sold for $14, equivalent to about $63 as of my making this. By 1983, Moss had released 5 volumes of his cheap radio thrills, albeit with each new volume being less daffy than the previous. Since Moss's death in 1994, fellow broadcaster Dan O'Day has assumed the cheap radio thrills mantle, though as of 2021, no new volumes have been made, nor do any appear to be in the pipeline. As far as stock music and such go today, it's a lot more staid, and is out of the hands of most small broadcasters, locked behind a wall of high prices and corporate bureaucracy. In case you haven't gotten the hint yet, I have indeed rounded up all 5 volumes of the cheap radio thrills series, although I had to settle for a 1977 issue of Volume 1 here. So much for keeping things all original. But anyway, in the name of period accuracy, I've taken all the bits that I want to run from these LPs, and I've transferred them to reel-to-reel tape at 7.5 inches per second, because that's more than likely how these would have been broadcast back in the 70s and 80s. Definitely not from the records proper. That just wouldn't have been practical. So anyway, let's finally get down to business here. Now, it seems like, certainly in the last 2 years or so, we've become kind of unintentional synthesizer nerds here in Archive Land. And so I figured I would draw upon these records' extensive use of synthesizers and create a nice long, if somewhat choppy, segment on it. So first up, I've got just this little 40-second mini montage, and the reason it's so short is because these are just little blurbs. These were intended for use in things like station IDs. But having said that, they weren't necessarily always used for that purpose. So the third and fourth blurbs that you'll hear in this set, and I'll point them out because they do kind of run together, I can swear I've heard them used in like home video logos and or TV station IDs, but I can't put my finger on it. And I've done some digging around and I looked up my old logo episodes and they're not in those. But I know I've heard them somewhere and I am dead serious. So if you know, let me know in the comments. This has been driving me up the wall since I started working on this episode, to the point where I've been losing sleep at night. Now, there's a series of music beds on Volume 2 here, on Side 1, that touts itself as being a bunch of synthesizer loops. But they're not loops in the sense that we would necessarily think of them, where you could play it seamlessly in a loop. And they don't necessarily work as music beds where you could quickly fade it out and back in or crossfade it. And there's 3 music beds where, while I don't doubt that there is synthesizer on them, they're tuned in such a way that it no longer sounds like a synthesizer, and or it is so buried in the mix that it just completely defeats its own purpose. So I call this bit Find That Synth. Now, there's a sequence at the end of Side 1 on Volume 5 here called Gonzo Effects to Cover Bad Splices. And you would think with a name like that, it would be some really in-your-face synthesizer thing to cover up a bad edit. But they tend to really back off here, so hopefully your edits weren't too bad. But I should take this opportunity to note that my copy of Volume 5 is in considerably worse condition than the other 4, to the point where anything you hear from Volume 5 in this episode is gonna stand out a bit. So between my crappy copy and the underwhelming Gonzo effects, I think I'd rather just tolerate the bad edit. Given that much of these 5 albums consist of just disparate bits and pieces of things, trying to break all this down by subject matter would just be a fool's errand. So for the remainder of today's episode, I'm going to run some little montages that I've cut together in my attempt at utilizing all these disparate bits and pieces. So, for starters, here, I want to run a little tribute that I made to all those morning zoo crew types and to guys like Rick Dees. So, I'm talking about those guys that would routinely inject bits of these albums into their regular shtick, thereby making them even more annoying than they already are. But anyway, I've taken all the most idiotic and at times lewd moments from these LPs and effectively just strung them together. So I don't talk on any of this. It's just a long line of stupid and or innuendo heavy sounds, and of course the twain often meet. So I should note here that Terry Moss at one point had an unrelated LP out called Jock Shots. I don't have that one. I've never heard it, but I've had that title kind of kicking around my head. So I came up with a couple of potential titles for this one: Jockey Shorts and Jocular Humor.
Super duck, yeah, yeah. Super duck, yeah, yeah. So hot, so hot. NICKEYMOU. Yay! The prize man! Come on, people!
Oh. Ooh. Ooh, ooh.
Number one. Good Deliciously different marijuana. Deliciously different marijuana. Solid gold. That's better.
One thing I really like about these albums is how they can hit so many targets in so little time.
Time for a commercial.
Okay, well, here's a commercial then, I guess.
These two portable radios are about to be dropped. Watch this daring crash test.
Only RCA Victor portables have the non-breakable impact case, as low as $29.95 at your RCA Victor dealers.
I'd like to think I have a pretty good appreciation of the late lamented comedy outfit Firesign Theater. Now, if you're not familiar with Firesign Theater, their whole thing was theater of the mind, and as such, perhaps unsurprisingly, their main mediums were albums and the radio. Now, at the same time, I also really love old TV horror movie hosts, creature feature type hosts. But up until this point, you've never been able to get that sort of thing on the radio. So what I've done here is I've taken those two worlds and I've mashed them together, and I've put together a 2.5-minute pitch reel for a little series that maybe I can get going someday called Horror Theater of the Mind. And in this installment of Horror Theater of the Mind, well, admittedly, I kind of came up a bit short on the horror end of things. If anything, this is kind of a mutant Dudley Do-Right cartoon, minus the cartoon part, of course. Okay, my concept might still need a little polishing, but hopefully you'll get the idea. But if you're not into that sort of thing, here's a little game you can play. Try and figure out how much of this is me just taking straight bits from the albums, not changing them in any way, and how much of this is me overdubbing different parts from different LPs on top of each other. Bet you can't tell the difference.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
These records have proven to be especially useful to me lately because, as you may or may not know, the archive has had its own little radio station for quite some time now.
For another commercial.
No, we've had enough commercials for today. Hey, don't fade me out! Bastards. Anyway, getting back to my radio station here. The archive has had its own low-powered station for quite some I think I figured out your game there. For a while now. And so that station would be KLAK, 640 AM, home of Sergei's Catacomb of Classics. And I've had the Cheap Radio Thrills LPs kicking around for almost 2 years now, but the reason I'm finally covering them now is because I'd kind of forgotten about them, but also because, for whatever strange reason, just in the last 2 months or so, we've started taking on some advertisers at KLAK, and some decent ones at that. But they're not providing us with finished commercials, so I found myself going into a territory that I never thought I would in my life. Making advertisements. And I sure as hell don't trust Sergey with it, especially when KLAK is finally starting to make at least a little money. So what you're going to hear now is, I would say an air check, but this is straight from the studio's direct feed. So you can have nice full stereo sound and not crappy AM. And what you're going to hear is a complete KLAK station break. And it's really a special one because it's from one of those rare moments where the usually automated KLAK was actually quasi-live for a change. Gene Clark closing out that set with From a Silver File, going to 1974's No Other for that one. Before that, we heard from the New York Dolls, who were just looking for a kiss. Before that, Fleetwood Mac with Before the Beginning, and Badfinger with It's Over to kick things off. Benny Boy here with you on one of those rare moments where we're actually not on autopilot. We're going to take a break here and come back with a really, really long one from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, because I need to go shoot some box segments for Oddity Archive. You're listening to America's last old school rock station, KLAK 640 AM and occasionally 1240 as well. Rock radio like your mother used to make.
Is there anyone who doesn't need a disc or another gizmo to patch into their radio?
That's right, the deals are spicy this week at Sibilant Sound, 336 North I Can't Drive. Sansui turntables from $550, Pioneer speakers from $450 each, and Marantz receivers from $650. Ask about our video gear. We have none. This week only at
Sibilant Sound.
It's hot. It's happening, y'all. Every night at Hollyweird, Sioux Falls' hottest 21 and up nightclub. 25-cent video poker and $1.50 Pabst always on tap. Smoking allowed. Smoking hot, that is.
Boogie, freak out,
Pick your mother.
bring yourself, or one another.
For the next 60 seconds,
For the next 60 seconds,
this station will conduct a test of the emergency broadcast system.
this is only a test.
This is a test of the emergency broadcast system.
The broadcasters in your area, in voluntary cooperation with federal, state, and local authorities, have developed this system to keep you informed in the event of an emergency. If this had been an actual emergency, the attention signal you just heard would have been followed by official information, news, or instructions. This station serves the Archive Land area.
And that concludes our test of the emergency broadcast system.
Did you pass?
On come on down to Shuck Chevrolet, where the deals are anything but corny. Purchase by March 17th and receive $5 cash back on any vehicle paid for in cash. Credit terms available, such as debt and interest. Trade-ins welcome, but not trade-offs or trade-wins. Shuck Chevrolet, where our motto is...
We've got your wheels and a smile and a handshake, and most of all, a hell of a nerve. It's your kind of music.
Deep cuts and familiar favorites, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The country's biggest library of old stuff. The home of the No Money giveaway, and of course, Sergei's Catacomb of Classics. Seated high atop Archive HQ, your kind of music is always on at 640 and occasionally 1240 on your AM dial.
K.
S, X, Y, was it X? What was it? D, was it?
We're gonna give you pictures of an exhibition.
If it weren't for my little demented ongoing quest to keep things as original and period appropriate as possible, I would say that my efforts at accruing all 5 of the original cheap Radio Thrills LPs was pointless. I say that because, as I learned making this episode, the whole series has been reissued on CD, or for download, and remains in print as of my making this, and at a considerably lower cost than the $75 or so that I spent accruing all 5 LPs. So if you're so inclined, head on over to danodea.com, where you can purchase or download cheap Radio Thrills and a bunch of other audio stuff for small broadcasters, and some of it vintage. But anyway, that is it for today's archive. Join us next time when the archive... hit it!
Does it by request? Thank you